In the scorching summer of 1716, 14 of the wealthiest planters of South Carolina gathered at the Grayfield estate. They thought it would be an ordinary business meeting. None of them came out alive. 3 days later, the authorities discovered charred bodies laid in a perfect circle around a massive coal furnace. Their hands were bound with iron shackles, their mouths stuffed with raw cotton. The sole witness was a slave woman named Esperanza de Lima. She sat in the kitchen, calmly humming a Portuguese lullaby and sharpening knives. To every question she replied with only one broken phrase in English. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns to the end. The colonial authorities concealed the incident. Governor Robert Johnson ordered the records sealed, and for more than 2 centuries the story remained buried in the archives of Charleston. But it became known as the Grayfield Massacre, an event that forced the planters to reconsider those they called property. Yet Esperanza's story began long before that night. In 1701, a Portuguese ship named Santa Maria arrived in Charleston carrying captives from Angola. Among them was a young woman of about 20. The colonists gave her the name Esperanza de Lima. None of them suspected she was the daughter of a chief, raised in the arts of strategy, negotiation, and knowledge of herbs and poisons. She had watched the Portuguese burn her village and kill her father. From that moment, every white man was bound in her mind to that sin. Edmund Grayfield, owner of a vast plantation, purchased her for 42 pounds sterling. He was notorious for his cruelty, even by the standards of that age. His estate served as the meeting place for the Rice Council, 14 planters who controlled the politics and economy of the colony. They discussed rice prices, slave regulations, and shared methods of crushing resistance. Esperanza pretended to be submissive, quickly learned English, yet often feigned misunderstanding. She listened, remembered, and nurtured her hatred. For years she observed her masters, watching them laugh while discussing the breaking up of families, boasting of tortures, and trading new ways to subdue slaves. By 1715, something entered her life that changed everything. She met a slave named Yum, a strong, intelligent young man who could read and secretly taught others. Their bond began with cautious meetings, songs, and signs that seemed harmless to overseers. Gradually, it grew into a secret network of information, patrol schedules, colonial laws, plantation weaknesses. They even established contact with free black communities in Florida, but in March of 1716, everything collapsed. Grayfield announced to the council an expansion of the breeding program. Female slaves were to be paired with men for improved offspring. Esperanza's name stood first on the list. For her, it meant the death of hope. Forced into being a breeding female, separated from Yum, their plans destroyed. That night, by a fallen cypress, she met her beloved. He begged her to flee immediately. A Spanish trader was ready to carry them to St. Augustine. But Esperanza refused. Escape will save us, but it will change nothing. These men will continue. I know their weaknesses. We have a chance to leave a mark. Yum feared torture, but knew she was right. Escape would save too. Her plan could wound the entire system. Together, they began preparing for the June Council. Esperanza calculated every step, the guests' habits, their weaknesses, the routes of servants. She even knew that one councilman always left early for relief, while another arrived before the others to make private deals. At the center of her design stood the great coal furnace in the estate kitchen. She had studied it for months, learned to master its heat, and secretly stockpiled coal. No one noticed. It seemed only like ordinary preparations for lavish feasts. 3 days before the meeting, news arrived that sealed her decision. Yum had been sold to James Rutherford. The day after the council, he was to be taken to a new plantation. For Esperanza, it meant the end of their bond and her own doom. She knew waiting was no longer possible. That evening, they met for the last time. Again he pleaded for her to flee. She only replied, "They think themselves gods. Tomorrow I will show them they are wrong." On the next morning, the 22nd of June, Esperanza began her final preparations. She inspected the kitchen, noting every detail, especially the iron shackles normally used on slaves. She planned to turn them to another purpose. From dawn, she stoked the furnace, slowly driving it toward its peak. That by midday on the 23rd of June, everything looked ordinary. The servants bustled. The table was set. The guests began to arrive. None of them suspected that Marco Sutton had always considered himself beyond the reach of any earthly authority. Esperanza watched him from the kitchen window as he clumsily dismounted his horse and handed the reins to his slave groom. He was 53, his body heavy with wine and excess, yet his eyes remained predatorily alive. Those eyes belonged to a man who had built his fortune on turning people into merchandise. His plantation was infamous for a particular kind of training, brutal process of breaking newly arrived Africans. Those who resisted too fiercely were sent to Sutton. He took pride in transforming proud men and women into hollow shadows. For such services, other owners paid him, acknowledging his skill. Edmund Grayfield greeted Sutton at the front door with the sort of ceremony planters reserved only for equals. For the servants, there was only the status of cattle. The two men withdrew to the study, discussing matters too sensitive for public ears: new methods of controlling slaves and pressuring the colonial government to expand the trade in human cargo. One by one, the other members of the Rice Council began to arrive. Esperanza knew them all, their voices, their faces, their habits. William Peyton came with armed overseers, fearing new uprisings. James Rutherford, the magistrate, carried ceremonial pistols as a symbol of authority. Henry Caldwell rolled up in a carriage bearing his crest, flaunting ambition. They exchanged pleasantries, as though their wealth was not built on human bones. At exactly 2 o'clock, Grayfield opened the session. 14 men took their seats around the oak table imported from England. The polished panels reflected the candlelight, emphasizing their sense of superiority. Esperanza served the dishes in silence, listening to every word. The conversations flowed as usual: rice prices, harvest profits, how to squeeze maximum labor from slaves with minimal expense. Peyton boasted of his system of incentives: tiny rewards for exceeding quotas and merciless punishments for falling short. Rutherford nodded approvingly. Separated families worked harder, since hope of reunion became a whip. Others shared their practices: how to starve, how to breed people selectively for improvement. Their words were cold and precise, like craftsmen discussing tools. Esperanza moved silently through the hall, but in her mind she recorded every detail: who drank more, who slipped away more often, who sat closest to the exit. Inside her, a dark resolve was growing. Later, over dessert and brandy, they relaxed. Their faces flushed, their voices grew louder. Sutton, with a satisfied grin, described a new Caribbean cage oven where the defiant were slowly roasted alive. Samuel Kingsley spoke of breeding experiments, pairing slaves like livestock. But the final spark came from the youngest, George Baxter. "Gentlemen," he said as Esperanza poured the brandy, "the Spaniards pay handsomely for experienced slaves. We could pool our money for a ship and start shipping out the old, the worn out." The room came alive. They discussed profits, routes, connections for permits. Esperanza listened, and in that moment, something inside her broke. For 15 years, she had searched for excuses, believed that even their cruelty had limits. But no limits existed. Their greed had no bottom. And so she decided the time had come. At 9:47, by the German clock ticking in the dining room, Esperanza made her move. She had long been feeding the coal furnace in the kitchen, raising the heat. In the cellar, she had prepared shackles. Into the brandy, she had slipped an herbal mixture, the legacy of her grandmother, who knew the secrets of poisons. Baxter was the first to falter. He tried to blame his weakness on alcohol and heat, but soon slumped in his chair. Next came Peyton, pale and nauseous. Rutherford rubbed his eyes, unable to focus. Sutton's trembling hands dropped his glass. Only Grayfield, realizing too late, managed to whisper, "We have been poisoned," before collapsing to the carpet. Within 20 minutes, all 14 were unconscious. Esperanza acted without haste. She fastened them with iron shackles, the same instruments that had crippled thousands of slaves. To each she whispered words, in Portuguese, in Spanish, in broken English. To Sutton, "You break spirits. Today I will show you what it means to be broken." To Rutherford, "You tear families apart. Now you will lose everything." To Grayfield, "You could have chosen mercy, but you chose profit. Today I choose." Through the night, straining her body, she dragged them to the kitchen. By dawn they lay in a circle around the furnace, shackled, their mouths stuffed with cotton. The furnace blazed, radiating infernal heat. When the first awoke, his eyes widened in terror. Then came muffled cries, smothered by cotton. For the first time, these men felt helplessness. Esperanza sat in the corner, methodically sharpening knives. Then she rose, looked each of them in the eye, and said, "Good morning, gentlemen. Today we will speak of justice." She walked around the circle, naming them one by one, reminding them of each crime. She asked Peyton about the woman Asher, whom he forced to labor until childbirth and then robbed of her child. She reminded Warwick how he had paid for the right to strike a runaway with his own hands. The heat grew fiercer. Sweat streamed down their faces, their eyes filled with dread. Esperanza went on, her voice calm and steady, just like theirs had been when they spoke of rice prices. And at that very moment, April of 1715 left a chilling record in the archive: the sale of a 14-year-old boy named Caesar. His master marked him as breeding stock and priced him at £45 sterling. A note said his mother was unmanageable and therefore sold or eliminated. 2 months later, a woman named Rebecca died in childbirth. The child survived, but the owner coldly calculated a loss of £20 and ordered improvements to the breeding fund. Page after page displayed the brutal bookkeeping of human misery. Families torn apart, children turned into property, people reduced to numbers. For Esperanza, every entry was not just history, but a life destroyed. For 2 hours, she forced the captive men to confront these records. Names, punishments, deaths, all remembered with terrifying precision from her 15 years of observation. When the kitchen heat rose above 45 degrees, her plan advanced. She pulled heavy furnace rods, heated them until cherry red, and pressed them against her captives. The screams carried across the estate. These men who had branded slaves now felt the helplessness they once inflicted. She worked methodically, burning hands, legs, faces, scars that would last. Between torment, she spoke of their sons and futures, showing them the cruelty of their legacy. When exhaustion nearly claimed them, she revived them with water, denying the release of death. By evening, she dragged them close to the furnace and forced them to endure the same circle of fire once used against slaves. By nightfall, 14 of the most powerful men in the district lay broken. Their hoarse screams faded into silence. Esperanza sat calmly, sharpening her knives, humming a lullaby from her ruined village. Edmund Grayfield, the estate's master, was the last to die, begging for ransom until his voice was swallowed by the flames. At dawn on June 25, 1716, plantation workers discovered 14 charred bodies arranged around the furnace. Esperanza sat at the table, knives in hand. Overseers could not believe one woman had destroyed so many masters, but the fact was undeniable. White supremacy had trembled. The colonial authorities panicked. They could not let her act become a rallying cry, nor allow her to live. Officially, Grayfield and his guests died in a fire. Esperanza was condemned to be sold to Spanish traders for the mines, a slow death. Secret orders were given to ensure she would not survive the voyage. Records claimed she died of fever at sea. But whispers told another story, that she had allies among sailors, that she prepared escape. In her final days, she shared her knowledge with others. Herbs, anatomy, the weaknesses of masters. Justice burns slowly, but it burns to the end, she told them. Many remembered those words. Her acts spread like wildfire. Slaves set fires on plantations. Livestock perished mysteriously. Overseers met with accidents. For the first time, whites felt fear. New laws banned slaves from gathering or carrying tools, yet resistance only grew. Her legend traveled beyond the fields, reaching freedmen and secret networks that later formed the road to freedom. No one knew if she died at sea or found liberty in the Spanish colonies, but her memory lived on as proof that even one woman, stripped of everything, could shake the system. Years later, when the archives were opened, the truth no longer mattered. Oral traditions had carried her story across generations. Masters were no longer sure of their invincibility. Slaves no longer believed they were powerless. From that shift was born the beginning of slavery's end.